This is the unmistakable look of an E60 BMW 5 Series. Now this is not an ordinary 5 Series, it's an M5. And it's not any M5, it's an M5 Touring. Only 1,025 of these were built, which makes them a rare breed. Even more so given that BMW have not made a Touring M5 ever since. It came with a 5-litre V10, celebrating BMW's Formula 1 involvement. Of course, this engine, designated S85, and the 3-litre Formula 1 engines didn't have much in common other than having 10 cylinders in V formation and gargling some sort of petrol. Actually, they do have one interesting commonality. The engine blocks were both cast in the same foundry in Landshut, Germany. As petrolheads, we should celebrate those people involved who made it possible for a saloon car and its estate version to have a 507 horsepower V10 under the bonnet. Especially since in today's economical and political climate, this would not be possible. Not everybody was happy with the E60 though. In fact, the looks were pretty divisive, and not just those of the 5 Series. Chris Bangle, head of design at that time, got a lot of heat for the entire model range. I felt the same after seeing the E66 7 Series. Today, my view is different though. Well, maybe not on the pre-facelift 7 Series, but definitely on some of the other models. I watched an old Top Gear episode recently. The guys were on the Isle of Man with the then new Aston Martin V8 Vantage, a 911 Carrera S and a BMW M6. And in that dark Indianapolis red, I thought the M6 was looking fabulous. But I might be a little biased since I used to own a 130i 5-door hatchback, and I loved it. Beyond the looks, the E60 has always been a capable and worthy 5 Series. On one side, it had loads of tech and more gadgets than a Bond car, one of them being the infamous iDrive system. On the other, it had above average dynamic capabilities, and those are what I am particularly interested in. Oh, and by the way, this M5 Touring is a tiny bit more special than others. Look at the color. This is azurite black metallic, a BMW individual color that is only found on 11 other cars. Estate cars, that is. I think this is a nice place to be, if a little dark with this all black merino leather interior. The only highlights being these aluminium panels on the dashboard and the doors. I think it has aged well, still looking rather modern in here. The cabin is roomy, the seats are comfortable, the steering wheel is BMW typically rather chunky. Here's the last generation M car drive selector with a few options. There's iDrive, back then an inexhaustible source of BMW bashing materials. Today it's not only common, it's one of the best systems out there. You can have the touchscreen, or you can choose to have the haptic feedback of the rotary control knob, and new models will even recognize your gestures. Mate, you should have seen us flying up the mountain pass.
Starting Fruit Ninja.
But there are two things I never liked about the interior of the E60. It's nothing serious, just a matter of preference. I preferred the 4-dial instrument cluster from the E39 over this 2-dial one, which just seems too narrow and a little cramped. The other one is the dashboard. The E60 was the first one to have a dashboard that is not angled towards the driver, which makes the cockpit a little less snuggly, which is unfortunate because you sit low, the seats hug you tight. It would have been perfect. But now, let's see how this thing drives. This car came with what must have been the most interesting, or one of the most interesting buttons in automotive history. But let's look at this car in DEFCON 5 first. There are two things that bothered me 5 years ago when I bought this car that continue to bother me to this day. Unsurprisingly, one of those things is the gearbox, but the other is the steering, and the latter bothers me far more than the former. The steering in the E60 is hydraulically assisted. The F10 then introduced electric power steering. Unfortunately, this one does not help the case of the dying hydraulic systems. It is too light and too vague to be able to place the front wheels accurately. There is plenty of grip. This car has brand new Michelin Pilot Sport 4S's, yet the steering is not exactly confidence inspiring. The curious thing is, I've never heard anybody criticizing the steering on the E60, so it might be this particular car, or it might be me. A lot has been said about the gearbox, the SG3 already, and I largely agree with the criticism. Yes, it is slow and dim-witted, especially when cold, and yes, it is grinding its gears as much as the driver is grinding his teeth, because you can't help but think that the clutch is not exactly in its comfort zone. And it has 7 settings, which seems rather silly. With this steering, with this gearbox, and despite the tires, the car does not feel like it wants to be rushed. It's only in a straight line when you put your foot down that you will get a whiff of the car's sporting potential. Fortunately, there is a way to unleash all that potential. So let's put the car in DEFCON 1. And we even have a button for that. And it's not only the engine firing on all 10 cylinders now, it's the entire setup. The steering is heavier now and much more precise. The gearbox, of course, is still the same, but in its most ferocious setting, It's quite an event when it bangs in the next gear. The dampers are firmer now, and even though the car cannot exactly hide its weight, it does a much better job of staying level. But the thing that I love most, by far, is the throttle response. This being a big naturally aspirated engine with individual throttle bodies, the moment you go off the pedal, the throttle body slams shut and you go through the windscreen. But it is incredibly balanced for a car like this, and you have to push it really, really hard to unsettle that balance. I am not a huge fan of these driving modes. There are cars that let you configure 1,000 parameters, and yet the car feels exactly the same. In this M5, it works though. Why would I want to buy an E60 M5 or an E61? I like my engines to be big, high revving and naturally aspirated. This should not come as a surprise after I said that one of my favorite things about this M5 is the jolt that goes through the car when you step on the accelerator. I was looking at alternatives, even other BMW models. I looked at E39s, E46s and E92s, but in the end it was clear to me that I had to have the V10. And then I came across this one. It was quite high mileage, but it was in good nick, and I thought a relatively inconspicuous estate with a 5-litre V10 would be an outrageous combination. I know it has vents in the wings with M5 badges and 4 big exhaust pipes. But then I also learned that M5 Tourings were rather scarce, even more so in azurite black metallic. So I had to have it. I knew it wasn't the best to drive. I knew it was expensive to run, and I knew it was fragile. Actually, I thought it was fragile. According to the internet, the engine would explode just by merely closing the bonnet too hard. So what can I report then on a 13-year-old car with 170,000 kilometers? 2 years ago, I had to replace the fan that blows fresh air into the cabin. And in the same year, the engine went wrong. Or rather, it went into limp mode. It turns out one of the electronic throttle control units had failed and needed to be replaced, which I admit was expensive. Yet, my wife's Touran, which is 10 years newer than this, had already more electronic issues. The engine in this one is running absolutely smooth, and I'm doing my best to keep it that way. I am careful to only ever stress it when it's warm. I try to keep the engine oil as fresh as possible, and it seems to work. I don't regret buying this car at all. The final question then is this a driving distilled car? It is heavy, it has its quirks, and by today's standards it's not even very fast anymore. And yet, when I hear that glorious V10 scream, all its shortcomings are forgotten. No, it's not a driving distilled car. And yet, I think it deserves to be an honorary member for an extraordinary engine and a unique sound.